Check, check one, check two. Can y'all hear me out there? Yeah? How you feeling? Good. Feeling pretty good? Can you say it one more time? How you feeling? Good. All right, thank you. Yeah, that's a strong good. All right, my name is Michaela, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to Sankofa Video and Books. Do we have any first timers here? Okay, can we give them a round of applause? Us too. Very short description of Sankofa. Sankofa Video and Books was founded in 1997 by filmmaking couple Hailey and Sharifia Nagarima. You might be familiar with their film, which is now available to stream on Netflix. And they also have more films in the back. And currently, we're fundraising for the film Black Lions, Roman Wolves. Just a little bit about us. We're a Pan-African sanctuary for books by and about people of African descent, and we're just happy to have you here. So, why are we here? We're here to celebrate Orisanmi Burton's latest release, Tip of the Spear. He's in conversation with Dr. Myers. A little bit about Mr. Burton. He's an assistant professor of anthropology at American University. His research employs ethnographic and archival methods to examine historical collisions between Black radical organizations and state repression in the United States. Dr. Burton's work has been published in North American Dialogue, The Black Scholar, Radical History Review, American Anthropologist, among other outlets, and has received support from the Winter-Gren Foundation, the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University, and the Margaret Casey Foundation, which selected him as a 2021 Freedom Scholar. Dr. Burton's first book, entitled Tip of the Spear, Black Radicalism, Prison Repression, and the Long Attica Revolt, was published by the University of California Press October 31st, 2023, so it is still brand new. We have copies available that I'm sure people would be too mad to sign. And thank you for the show. He's in conversation with Dr. Joshua Myers, who is the Associate Professor of Africana Studies at Howard University. He's the author of We Are Worth Fighting For, a History of Howard University Student Protests in 1989, and the editor of the Gathering Together Literary Journal. Cedric Robinson, The Time of Black Radical Tradition, is his second book, and he has another forthcoming title that maybe we'll talk about before we end the event. But without further ado, Dr. Joshua Myers and Dr. Orisanmi Burton.
Thank you for this book, and thank you all for being here. I want to start first, though. This book is about rebellion, and we just lost a really important figure who has, in many ways, brought about the relationship between art and culture and rebellion. In fact, we see it in Sankofa, Hailey Nagarima's Sankofa, Hailey Nagarima, a member of the LA Rebellion film school, right? The person that coined the term LA Rebellion was Clyde Taylor, who just made his transition and so on. So I just wanted to be in this space and honor his memory. Someone I imagine would have an acerbic critique of the Attica documentary. We won't go down that road, or maybe we will. But just noting his passing in a world where he was a giant. He was a giant in this world, but not so much to the people who live outside of it. And so if you don't know that name, please get familiar with Clyde Taylor, who made this transition this week. So this is our second time doing this. We did an initial event a little further into the heart of DC at Bowl Co-op, which is housed at Creative Grounds, which they actually see Sankofa as the inspiration, one of the inspirations in the city for their formation. But this particular, at that particular event, which was sponsored by American University, Anti-Racist Center, I actually wrote a few lines to really make sure that I say what I want to say about this text. And since this one is being, that one wasn't recorded, and since this one is being recorded, I thought I would put those words further on the record as an opening gesture to this conversation. And then I'm going to ask maybe 2 or 3 more questions, and then it's going to be you. I think it's important for us to engage Dr. Burton and his work in a very particular way. I think this work is not an ivory tower text. Right? It's a text for us. It's a text for the people on the ground who are doing the work, organizing, thinking about where we are in the world. Right? It's not just a historical text for us to think about the past. And so I'm going to open up with my words, then a few questions. I still read off a laptop like it's 2010. When you read Tip of the Spear, you'll be reading a text that rewrites the narrative of Attica and reorients our senses of its meaning. Some will be drawn to the text out of their interest in the story, which has been seized upon in the American liberal imagination as important. Pulitzers and award-winning documentaries have us thinking that it's the story that's interesting and it's the story that should concern us. So the most significant thing about Tip of the Spear may be its framing. In some ways more significant than the story itself. Though the story does not get lost in the reframing, is the lens which I think is perhaps most critical, because it is one that we can apply to Attica and many other stories. The prevailing historiography reads the story of Attica, like almost all historiographies, as a story about an American prison that experienced a riot. Liberal interpretations focus on the things that went wrong as the prison itself as a concept was not already wrong. They rely on the historian's tools, the archive, as if that's where the story lives. Early on in Tip of the Spear, Orisanmi Burton destabilizes this frame and opens us up to how to write about Black radicalism differently, how to see ourselves differently. Early on in the book, he writes, quote, "We must unshackle our analytical frameworks from the cognitive prison of white Western rationality and refuse to impose knowledge paradigms developed to justify the current social order upon movements that aim to unmake that order." Got to sigh after that a little bit. Generated by deep and long-term relationships of trust, my analytical method takes the Black radical epistemologies, narratives, and modes of argumentation of those with whom I am in community, as both a point of departure and lodestar, end quote. So there are chapters that place Attica within a continuum of Black radicalism, revolt, a tradition, if you will, and chapters that focus on the rebellions in the immediate build-up to 1971. That tradition does not begin in prisons, though it finds itself there, for a reason. Burton writes about us as if we did not appear ex nihilo, as if we did not develop a critique only when somebody decided to put handcuffs on us and leave us in a cold cell. So this is a book that takes seriously the autonomous frames of reference that Black folk generated to survive Western civilization, survive America, and thus resist the incarnation of American global order that decided containment was its best option. We didn't just resist, to riff on Kalani Yassalam. We resisted. So there's that. But there is also the power of thinking alongside people who did not call themselves revolutionaries, like Bugs, perhaps one of the most striking interviews in the text. Burton takes time to focus on the masculinities and sexualities at place in the carceral system and how Blackness converges, always converges, with those systems of social order and technology of surveillance and repression too. There's also Burton's purposeful reading and rereading of state archives across the grain of what he knows, what we know and can feel about ourselves. Through the fraught tools of ethnography and archival disobedience, Burton reaches for something beyond, something found in only knowing Black radicalism as a real thing, a living tradition. And if I might do a thing really quick, Burton actually practices Black study as I have understood it and have written of it. In many ways, but the ways in which he mines the archive of behavioral adjustment protocols, the experimentation on Black revolutionary minds, the captive populations who were subject to the violence of both the disciplinary regime of carcerality and the disciplinarity of academic science, offers models for us. It also offers further clues for how our disciplines were formed out of the violence of colonial and carceral order. Those who dare revolt, the other, the deviant, the criminal, the nigger, had to be reduced to specimen and subject in order to maintain the primacy of what Sylvia Wynter calls man, what Burton calls white man, in his political, social, and even sexual power. This is how to read the colonial and state archive as one of violence. Black study marks the disciplines in the social and behavioral senses that made this sense, as the problem. Black study marks those spaces as the problem, in other words. So we are here at our in the Black space with Black people, talking about a story that affected Black people, but with a framing that is different. A framing that takes Black thought, Black study, Black thinking traditions, Black capacity for knowing as central to unpacking that story. So I want to start with a question that allows us to enter into that particular framing through a bit of the personal, but also I think the genealogical and the intellectual and political sense. And my question asks Dr. Burton to walk us through Eddie Ellis's life. Someone who, it will become apparent in a few minutes, is critical to the unfolding of this text, but also of the political urgency and the political framing that you insist on in this text.
Thank you so much, Josh, for that beautiful introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming. I appreciate it. There's a few seats up here in the front if folks want to sit down. Yeah, starting off with Eddie is a great idea. In some ways, I start the text with Eddie. One of the first interviews I did when I first started to research the book was with Eddie Ellis. I'm going to tell you who he was in a minute. And he essentially said to me during that conversation, when I was asking him about the 25 years he spent in prison and about the sort of organizing that he was involved in at that moment, I was very interested in what was happening in the present. And in the interview, he introduced me to a kind of Black radical pedagogy in the sense that he refused to answer my questions in the way that I was asking them. And in a sense, instructed me that I was, and informed me that I was asking the wrong questions and asking them in the wrong way, and that the answers to the questions had already been produced, but I had to know how to look for them and how to ask for them. He was instructing me that I had to think more historically, because I couldn't actually contemplate the answers to the questions until I understood the sort of historical development and the process that I was looking into. And so that was really the path that set me, that's what really set me on the path to writing this book. So Eddie Ellis was a member of the Harlem Black Panther Party, which is a particular formation of the Black Panther Party that was more associated with the Revolutionary Action Movement. And that particular formation was started by, Eddie Ellis was a founding member, also Muhammad Ahmad, formerly known as Max Stanford, Queen Mother Moore, who's actually the figure that I start the book with. These are the folks who started that formation. And they started it after organizing with Kwame Ture in Lowndes County, Alabama, and engaging with that earlier Southern formation of the Black Panther idea, and they brought it to New York. He was incarcerated in 1969, spent 25 years in prison, and was in Attica during the infamous Attica Rebellion of 1971, although he didn't participate. He survived that and then started a political formation behind the walls called the Greenhaven think tank, and they started to carry out demographic and geographic research on the prison system, and actually revealed quite a few insights that people still seem to not have fully internalized today. And much of the research they did from behind the walls was later appropriated by academics, appropriated by public policy thinkers, right? So this whole idea of invest, divest, this idea that prisons are in fact a form of institutionalized theft of resources that should be redistributed to communities in other ways so that prisons aren't necessary, right? That kind of abolitionist way of thinking. The think tank was really central in developing that way of thinking. So this is the person with whom I was interviewing. And so during that interview, he said to me, you know, what we really need is we need someone in your position with academic credentials who can demonstrate using the tools of academia that our analysis of the prison system is a better analysis. And so he invited me, and in fact, enjoined me to play that role. And so this is sort of the genesis of the project. It grows not out of me sort of in the abstract looking through the library for gaps in the academic literature, but rather from an internal Black radical demand for a more rigorous accounting of where the carceral state comes from, with the idea that the dominant criminal justice narrative of prisons mystifies more than it reveals.
Awesome. So I'm gonna read again. And I think, you know, the importance of inviting your actual words from the text into the space is critical. But there's a piece of this that I think is critical to us understanding how Attica unfolds. Most of us, when we come to an Attica event, for lack of a better framing, let's start from the rebellion and go, right? But your book doesn't do that. Your book shows us that the rebellion has not just a prehistory, but a relationship to the long history of Black struggle, the long history of Black self-defense, the long history of Black people recognizing that we are at war, right? That's where the rebellion actually comes from. And so in line with that, there's a really beautiful passage that I didn't get to read at the last event, but I want to read it here from brother named Lukman. And he's writing a letter to his son, right? Mm-hmm. And he's talking about what we might call rebellion, the rebellious spirit, if you will, the thing that animates Black rebellion, right? So if we're not talking simply about external conditions, there are external conditions that are also in conversation with how we think and how we move and how we behave and how we react to that stimuli that comes from somewhere else. English has a really hard time putting a handle on what that thing is, but Lukman, I think, defines it perfectly in this letter to his son. So I'm going to read a little bit of this letter. And again, this comes from chapter 2 of the text where you walking us through like what goes into the Attica Rebellion, what precedes the Attica Rebellion. It's been 75 pages or so, right, before we even get to Attica proper, right? And so this is, let me just do this paragraph where you contextualize. This is on page 73. Lukman's refusal to re-narrate terror and to instead transmit that which brought him and others joy intimates an affective condition that the racial colonial violence of the state could neither penetrate nor extinguish. For those ensnared within this war zone was also a site of intimacy. For those ensnared within, this war zone was also a site of intimacy, care, and oasis, of narrative and subjective innovation. While defending their living, breathing bodies, This formerly dehumanized population offered new practices of knowledge and sociality into existence. These practices constitute and reflect the spirit of rebellion, about which so many of the rebels wrote. It is through these fleeting and improvisational labors of Black speculative perfection that demands for a departure from normative humanity are made and remade at the interstices of war. That's Orisanmi. But this is Luqman. Here's what he says. Really beautiful passage. He says, I know without being told that you and your stubbornness are many and they are surely mine. That in your silence you see the countless thousands of things that is the world around you, and rather than speak or express your awareness of them in words, you feel them deep inside. And what you feel is like the notes of music, each different, yet somehow related to each other, so that they seem to create a sound. But the sound they make is strange and different than the music that you hear in your mind. So they will say, oh, he is so silent, so quiet. And they will not know that you see and hear and are aware, but do not understand how or why they make the strange sounds they make. And later, when you are older and able to express yourself, you will try to tell them that they are making the wrong sounds, that what they make is not music, but they will tell you that you are stubborn and do not understand. This is what you will always have between you and the world, for you hear the sound of a different drummer. If that ain't Black existence. So please walk us through why you decided to include that.
No, thank you so much. So let me give you a little bit of context. So, the Attica Rebellion of 1971 is commonly understood to be a prison rebellion that occurred between September 9th and September 13th, 1971. And the way it's popularly narrated was that it was a rebellion against brutal prison conditions, which of course it was, but it was also a rebellion against empire, racial capitalism, and the long history of a war on African people in the Western Hemisphere. And so part of what the book tries to do is to make that clear. Another thing that the book tries to do is to challenge sort of Western historiography and challenge the way in which the history of our people's struggle is often written, not just from the perspective of the victors, but is written in ways that sort of truncate or minimize the dynamism of Black historical consciousness and Black political movements, the complexity of it. And I think this way of writing about struggles that occur primarily in prisons is a primary example of that, because it's always as if the rebellions that occur in prison are primarily just a response to immediate conditions as opposed to broader critiques of the social order. And the sort of materials that people use to tell these stories tend to be, official government reports, lawsuits, forms of evidence that cleave very narrowly to a kind of highly rationalist political sensibility. And so part of what I tried to do in the text is to think really broadly and creatively about what constitutes a primary source. And so what Brother Josh just read is a letter written from Larry Luqman White, rest in peace. He passed away right before the book came out, unfortunately. Genius, by all accounts, in lots of different ways. Autodidact, self-taught, dropped out of third grade, dropped out at third grade, taught himself to read and became, a political activist, philosopher, all while behind the walls. So this is a letter that he wrote to his son from behind the walls, and it's a love letter, but it's also a coded critique of the prison system. He's actually giving us a different way of understanding why the rebellion happened. And he's talking about it through the language and the epistemology, the way of knowing, a different way of knowing. He's talking about it through music. And I think this is part of what we have to understand when we're thinking about Black radicalism. It's not only going to express itself through these sort of sort of narrowly political frames of reference. So he's talking about music, but he's really talking about rebellion. He's giving us a reason for the rebellion. The people were making the wrong sounds. they couldn't hear what we were saying, right? He also talked about, how he and his friends would sometimes talk about jazz at the same time that they were talking about politics. And so that's sort of what I was trying to do there, is to give us a glimpse of some of the dynamic ways that this sort of incarcerated Black political philosophy unfolds. And that part of the political function of the prison is not only to incarcerate these people physically, but to incarcerate their ideas and to keep the kinds of knowledge that's circulating among and between them from reaching us. Because it's in fact very dangerous and subversive knowledge, and in fact the state knew this. And there's layers to that passage, right? And so he ends it by saying, you march to the sound of a different drummer. And that's in fact a citation. And we would tend to think that, citations are something that academics use. You make a sentence and then you put the parentheses and you put the author and then you go and look in the bibliography. That's a very academic thing, one would think. But Luqman is also engaging in citational practice, and he's citing a novel called A Different Drummer, which is about this African community that suddenly erupts in a riot after this town dweller inexplicably burns down his own house and leaves the town. And then all the other Black people in the town follow and leave. And the story is told from a white perspective, and they're trying to figure out, well, why did these Negroes burn down their own house? And you never really find out because it's from their perspective. And so in some ways, the novel that he's citing reflects the problem that I was trying to deal with, which is, how can we really understand Black rebellion if we only ever use sources created by people who don't understand Black rebellion? And where do we find those actual sources?
So we can listen, we've dealt with spirituality, we've dealt with music, we've dealt with literature. Which, by the way, Cedric Robinson, the teacher, Kelly, in his intro to African American Studies class. That book, yeah. And Chester Himes, and like all the people who are dealing with prison from the literature side, which is interesting. Maybe you can talk about this later. How do we narrate the development of the critique of the prison that has now become, I wouldn't say dominant, but certainly prominent, which does not start from academics. It starts from people like Chester Himes, and it starts from people like Eddie Ellis, right? Look, I was going to ask now. So as I think it's necessary now to walk us through the what happened question. And for those who may not be familiar with the timeline of the Attica Rebellion, essentially, how do you deal with not just the dominant historiography, but how did you connect to what happened through the lens and the sources that you privileged to tell a different or similar timeline, but from different angles?
So, ultimately what I realized that what Eddie was asking me to do, he said, we've never been able to prove that our analysis is a better analysis. And their analysis was that prisons are a domain of war, and that prisons are in fact a microcosm of a broader war that's been waged on Black people since our arrival in the Western Hemisphere. And so in order to write the book, I had to study war. And what does that mean? It means that instead of thinking about the prison as a broken system that needs to be fixed, in fact, thinking about it as a strategy, a coherent strategy that was developed in order to neutralize us, neutralize our political capacity, and to keep certain forms of dangerous knowledge from reaching us and from flourishing. And so then from that perspective, it actually inverts the way that people typically think about prison rebellions. People typically think about prison rebellions, as I said, as a response to poor prison conditions. I'm arguing that the prison is actually a response to our political movements. So in that sense, and I try to show how sort of administrators of war applied techniques and technologies that were developed in foreign theaters of war for anti-colonial warfare all over the world and used those as a way to develop and advance the prison. So the prisons of today are institutionalized forms of warfare. So in that sense, if we think about the year 1970 or 1967, this is when the use of prisons to contain political movements, especially in sort of northern cities, starts to intensify. If we look at the history of the counterintelligence program, if we look at the history of sort of police red squads in cities like New York and Chicago, we can see that state actors were very clearly thinking about how to use prisons to contain movements. So that's step one. But what I try to show in the book is that that in fact backfires, right? And so prisons were being used to contain the urban rebellions that were erupting all over the country in the 1960s. And what you start to see beginning in 1968 is what? The eruption of prison rebellions. So all they did really was displace this sort of political dynamism that was erupting in the streets into prisons. And so beginning in 1968, prisons really become a very intense battleground in which actors on both sides of the struggle were consciously thinking about war and applying war strategies, right? And so Attica, the prison rebellion that many of you have heard about, and most of you have probably heard about it, not because of the dynamism of the rebellion, but because of the intensity of the way that it was repressed, which is itself a kind of psychological warfare on us, because, we leave thinking that what's most important about this movement is its repression, as opposed to all it has to teach us about organization and political struggle. And the repression of Attica was only, it's this huge massacre, right? That also involves intense sexual violence, which I show in the book. And then from that point on, prisons start to mutate or reform in ways that are specifically designed to prevent what I would say is new George Jacksons or new Dhoruba bin Wahaj from being born, right? And this is the sort of conscious strategy, and this is the prehistory that we're living in today. And so, it would be easy to walk around and not think about the prison as war, and that's partially why they're so effective at doing what they do, because it's a kind of a hidden war that's quite mystified. But so part of what I'm trying to do is to open up that history and give us a way to think about war, domestic war in this way.
So the other part about this is, so we have the rebellion proper, we have the violent repression in the moment. Many of the rebellious actors are killed. Others of them are sent to other prisons. It kind of sounds like a enslaved African rebellion, right? Kind of what they did in the VC rebellion in 1822. And so this ongoingness of it is really critical too. But then the strategies of the prison begin to change. And I think the modern prison, that in a modern prison industrial complex, right? And the ways in which the whole system of incarceration and criminalization works now owes a lot to their new strategies at this moment. You spend a lot of time talking about how they begin to update their strategies, just like at the Nat Turner's Rebellion, they banned reading and they banned the church and all the things that they thought were responsible. So can you walk through the modern prison system as a reaction to this rebellious struggle?
Yeah, that's the way I'm urging people to think about prison, right? As again, an institutionalized form of counter-revolution, masquerading as an apolitical crime control apparatus. And so when people talk about, the Attica Prison Rebellion, they tend to talk about the Attica Massacre, which should be talked about. It was a grotesque moment that included, it was the largest, it was the moment in which a largest single death, a largest amount of deaths in one encounter on U.S. soil since the Wounded Knee Massacre, right? So it deserves to be talked about. But part of what happens is that the violence mystifies these other kind of seductive and difficult to perceive forms of repression, which I really wanted to try to outline for us. Again, because the prison is a microcosm for the broader world. So my hope was that if people could really understand the ways that prison reform works as a kind of counterinsurgency, that they might understand how reforms operate on us here on the outside, right? And so part of what happens after Attica, again, is this wave of prison reforms, which have been celebrated. Now, it's a difficult contradiction to wade into because it is a contradiction, and I try to point out the contradiction, right? And I'll try to summarize it here, which is just essentially, you know, the book focuses on revolution and revolutionary aspirations, right? And for many of the people who were organizing as revolutionaries inside, there was something productive about how brutal the prison was, because it helped them radicalize people behind the walls, right? At the same time, people want to live. They want to survive. They want to see their families, right? So there's a contradiction there, right? Now, the form of warfare that starts to shape the prison after 1971 is counterinsurgency warfare, which is another name for counter-revolutionary warfare. And one of the key aspects of that is to try to exploit tensions within movements and try to cleave off, how to identify and isolate revolutionaries who can't be bargained with, who aren't gonna fall for, you know, concessions, who want revolution, people they call extremists. To cleave those people off from what the state understands to be the majority of the population who can be bribed or who can be incorporated into more institutional politics. And so that's the political function of reform under counterinsurgency, is to give concessions to the majority of the population. So think, for example, of the nonprofit industrial complex or our institutional context, the university, right, as a way to siphon off people who have radical aspirations, who otherwise might engage in other kinds of political activity. So once you siphon those people off and create an institutional framework that keeps them busy, essentially, it isolates the revolutionaries. It makes them easier to control and to neutralize, which is a euphemism for convert, capture, or kill. And so that's what happens out here in our so-called free world, and that's also what happened in the prison via prison reform. So after Attica, prison conditions improved. Now that's a really broad statement, and I try to tease out the contradictions of what that means in the text, but the point that I want to make here is why they improved. They improved because administrators of counterinsurgency knew that they had to raise the living conditions if they wanted to stem the tide of rebellion. And they improved unevenly. They didn't improve for everyone across the board. And so the places where the conditions improved were the places where they let the media in so they could tell everyone how good of a job they were doing. Meanwhile, that made it easier for them to isolate political prisoners and keep them in dungeons where we didn't see them and do experiments on them, right? So that's the contradiction of, the other thing that happened was you see the introduction of all these prison education programs, and you see the opening of the door to academics who are allowed to go into prison to do different kinds of research. The number of people with PhDs who were in some ways connected to the prison system multiplied. Right? So it becomes a site of intervention for intellectuals. And so again, so prison education programs were a way to try to destabilize already existing indigenous prison education programs where self-understood revolutionaries were already doing prison education, right? So it was a way to displace a certain kind of prison education and to replace it with the kind of education that encourages aspiration and inclusion into American empire as opposed to its overthrow. And so this is the history of prison education programs. Now, that's not to say that today, if you do a prison education program, you're a bad person, because that's often what people ask me. They want a simple answer. And you're not going to get a simple answer because the ethics and morality of war is different. And so when you you become complicit when you don't realize the historical context of what it is that you're engaging in, and you think it's just all honky-dory and all good. But if people enter into that context with an understanding of the history, I think it would be much harder for them to be weaponized against radical political education, which is how most of them are being used.
I just want to add some context. We were up here referencing stuff, and I realized we didn't give the full reference. The books that we were talking about earlier, A Different Drummer by William Melvin Kelly, and Chester Hines' If He Hollers, Let Him Go. These are two novels that were written way back then. But also, on the music point, Archie Shepp's Attica Blues. Archie Shepp, who is a friend of this space as well, is because it's reciprocal, right? So they're listening to the music, and then the musicians are listening to the rebellion in the prisons. And so he writes Attica Blues. My favorite example, or my favorite story, I should say, which is an example of this counter-revolution, is how TVs are introduced as a counter-revolutionary measure in the prison, just as they are introduced in the counter-revolutionary measure and outside of the prisons, in my estimation, too. But I also want to talk about, Jared, in your roundtable, talked about how this has relevance to media studies. And Jared Ball, Black Power Media, Jared Ball, talks about how this has relevance to media studies and framing and how the media supports the status quo. And so it's like there's an interesting way that this book allows people's particular interests to be highlighted. Because when I read it, I'm looking at the academic science part. It's like, damn, really? Of course, duh. And so there's a whole section of the book where these inmates are experimented on as a consequence of the rebellion in many respects. We have to understand where this, again, revolutionary spirit that they can't define, where it comes from, but in their mind, it's a mark of deviance. Let's figure this out, because we have to control it and manage it and maintain order. Can you please walk us through why it's important for us to understand that?
Yeah, it's a lot. I guess I'll start by telling the story of how I, came into that part, which is just like, and Josh mentioned this, part of what my method requires is that I take what people tell me seriously. And I start with what people tell me in terms of people who were part of this struggle. And one of the brothers told me about, all of these experiments that were happening. And I think it was the kind of thing where, it would be easy to brush it aside or just to be like, oh, whatever. And it also would be easy to just repeat what he said and not look into it. But, I tried to be, because I'm making strong arguments, I tried to be as rigorous as possible in the book. And so I took what he told me seriously, and I tried to investigate what was going on and essentially reach the conclusion that the New York prison system was a site of CIA MKUltra experimentation that were specifically around trying to figure out why certain kinds of Black people rebel, why they are radical. And also that the idea behind this was specifically around how can we acquire this knowledge so that we can redeploy what we learn on the general population. And so, I only scratched the surface, I'm sure, because I'm wading into things that people were intentionally trying to hide and to mystify. And so I'm, following breadcrumbs and sort of trying to make connections and this kind of thing. So I think I just sort of scratched the surface. But they were doing political experiments on people, trying to figure out what made them tick. They were doing sexual experiments on people, trying to see if they could change people's sort of sexual desires. I think because they believed that if they could manipulate people's sexuality, then the most sort of intimate part of them, then they could reshape their politics, or they could do anything else. And I think, so a lot of it's hard to know the results of the experiments because they didn't publish much of it. And MKUltra, the program itself was shut down in 1973, and the director of the CIA at the time ensured that all of the records related to that program were destroyed. And so the only reason why we know anything about that program is because someone found a mislabeled box of administrative files in 1977. But I do know that a lot of what they were trying to do to the brother that I was talking about, according to him, failed. And I think this is really important because there's a way in which when you start talking about this kind of thing that you can get this idea that, you know, these sort of, you know, counterinsurgency, intelligentsia, and the state is all powerful, but they didn't know what they were doing, really. They made a lot of mistakes, and ultimately, for many of the scientists who were doing this, it was really an excuse to use science to torture people, you know? So it's hard to know what the implications of these things are, but, you know, my philosophy in writing the book was just to tell the truth and to make it as clear as possible and to be as rigorous as possible with the hope that we would then have an opportunity to sort of build about it collectively in study groups and figure out how we're going to move in response to these things.
I mean, it's quite chilling. I was telling you earlier, I TA'd for Muhammad Ahmed, and some of this stuff happened to him too, and you can see it sometimes. Another reason it's quite chilling because the descendants of those law enforcement agencies and State Department agencies continue to target and recruit our students. And so there is a legacy of it, even though they might not have the results on, I'm sure they have it somewhere. But the legacy is in our criminology departments and in our anthropology and our political science, it's everywhere.
Can I just say, so the dude who did a lot of the experiments, see, I haven't put them on blast yet, but I guess I'm doing it now. One of the people who I named in the book, Donald Forgase, who was doing sexual experiments on people, there's still an award named after him at the University of Vermont, which is where he used to teach.
Right. So this is not, again, even though the 70s aren't that long ago, it's still present, right? In terms of how these disciplines and these institutions and the state all come together to operate, and also corporations, right? Y'all got questions? All right, I'll shut up then. Let's do Q&A. Thank you.
Hey, thank you. I just wanted to ask, I see like care and love feature prominently in both the immediate Attica struggle, and I think like you talk about like parts about like theatricality, how people show up for each other, but also in like the long Attica struggle, like I'm thinking about, I can't remember the name, but the letter between the father and son, like that was very, and like just like the power, like how I was really moved by how much of like the reflections from people in the aftermath of Attica was like focusing on family, focusing on love, those kinds of things, and that just resonated with my soul. And I was wondering if you could like go on about the power of care and love in a revolutionary movement, and I wonder how, if and how, you see those sort of politics carried through the present.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, most of you have probably heard Che's famous quote that, you know, revolutions are guided by genuine feelings of love. I think it's true. I mean, I think it's true, right? So one thing I try to talk about in the book is very much about war. And I'm arguing that actors on both sides of the struggle were consciously engaged in war. And sometimes that, well, it should make you uncomfortable. But part of why it makes people uncomfortable is because they have this idea that war is bad, which, sure, war is bad. But what I'm trying to show is that, you know, there's two different kinds of war. This is not a symmetrical war. It's not symmetrical in terms of the resources that each side has, and it's not symmetrical in terms of the ethics and morality, right? So whenever we talk about like political violence, the state always interprets that when sort of besieged communities engage in political violence, the state often narrates that as they're declaring war, that they're the ones who are starting this war, that they're waging war. which we know is ahistorical. They're doing it in Palestine right now, right? That actually what we're talking about is that people responding to a war that was imposed upon them, right? And so that's what the book is really about when we're talking about the Attica Rebellion. They're responding to a war that was waged upon them through what I would call a kind of counter war, a response to war. And the reason why that's important is because the war, the colonial war, is a war of accumulation, a war of expropriation, a war of violence. And the way that you can see that is by looking at what they do to their captives, right? So look at the ways in which people are tortured. I mean, just last week, Comstock Prison in New York, which is a prison that figures prominently in my book, it was just revealed that a lawsuit has been filed that incarcerated people in Comstock today have recently been waterboarded, beaten and waterboarded, right? And so part of what I do is try to show that on the other side, right, when the brothers who were involved in this rebellion have these opportunities to engage in different forms of retaliatory violence, that definitely does happen. But primarily when they get what they want, when they have the opportunity to do what they want, they engage in exactly what you just said. It's not about, okay, let's retaliate with maximum violence. It's about, okay, let's try to figure out how to disengage from this system, because that's not actually what they want. They're not looking for violence. They're not looking for harm. And so, in some ways, the chapter on the Attica Rebellion, for me as a writer, was an opportunity to back away from all of the violence that is happening in the book and to show what the world that these people were trying to build would look like. And it was a world that was very much about care. So they're figuring out how to equitably distribute resources, right? They're creating spaces for relaxation, for intimacy. They're taking long walks under the stars. They're singing songs. They're making plays, right? And so this is the content of the rebellion. This is the actual radical content of the rebellion. And the kind of counter-violence and militant armed self-defense is an apparatus that they developed in order to defend their capacity to engage in these other kinds of care and intimacy and love. And it's important that we understand that because it's not the same way on the other side. And you can see that in terms of how they treat, how they treat their captives. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for letting me talk about this. I wanted to ask you about madness. In your book, you talk about disrupting the white Western ideas of truth and who can be the arbiter of truth, and conspiracy, and not waiting for the state to confirm that it's doing something before we believe that they did it. And your choice to include the entirety of Caspar Baker Gary's petition in the book and letting the prisoners speak for themselves and their own experiences. I wanted to ask you about the relationship between insanity and the revolutionary spirit, and why it was important to include the entirety of that petition in the book.
Oh man, thank you. Well, all the people who are at the center of my book and the people who I talk to the most are people who have been criminalized and pathologized, rendered unworthy of consideration, unacademic, unintelligent, formally uneducated, crazy, like all of the things, right? These are the narratives that circulate in order to continually reproduce the carceral state and reproduce our acquiescence to it, right? And so, yeah, these are precisely the people that I knew I wanted to listen to and take seriously and see if I could unpack what was under these sort of pathologizing terms but the truth is that many of these people have different ways of thinking, right? And so, you know, with the madness, you know, I was trying to really see how I could avoid the kind of ableist language that makes it far too easy for us to dismiss people as just, you know, crazy or whatever, right? And so there's a critical disability studies scholar named Sharice Theory Pickens who wrote a book called Black Madness, Mad Blackness. And she talks about the different connotations of the word madness, right? So there's mad as in angry, right? There's mad as in like the language of hip hop in the 1990s, like a lot, capacious, right? And then there's mad in the sense of that someone's inhabiting a non-normative cognitive schema, and that all of these things are not necessarily mutually exclusive, and that people's mental states are not, they're dynamic, they shift depending on context. And so some of the brothers I talked to, they did a lot of courageous stuff or all kind of stuff. And I would ask, you know, like, why did you do that? Like, why did you do that? And some of them would just be like, yo, we was crazy, you know? But that, I was trying to open up what maybe is behind that, right? And so that's a little bit about the struggle of like writing about people who are constantly being pathologized. In terms of Casper Baker Gary is a person who passed away before I encountered him in the archive, but he wrote this powerful and sort of devastating letter testifying to the intensity of sexual violence that people were subjected to behind the walls. I wanted to include the entire letter so people could just see it from a visual standpoint. It's I think, quite emotive in just the way that it looks. I wanted people to be able to read it because I think there's other stuff that can be done with that letter. There are probably references or ways of analyzing it that I wasn't able to, because I think he's doing a lot, right? He's talking about sexual violence, but he's also talking about trying to conceptualize what it means to be human in a way that's totally different from what we're responding to. And I say that he was mad, and he was mad in all of the different ways that I just described. He was incarcerated in a carceral mental institution where he was subjected to electroshock treatments. But then I found this document from this sort of prison administrator who said, well, he wasn't really crazy. He was just pretending to be crazy so that he could infiltrate the mental institution and foment rebellion. I think both of those things are probably true. Just as an aside, he later starts a record label after he gets out of prison, and I think produces the second hip hop record ever to have rap in the title. It's called Astrology Rap. You can listen to it on YouTube. It's not very good, but it is interesting.
It was something that was mentioned earlier, talking about things like AI and MK Ultra and some other things. So Josh, you can respond to this as well, but you brought up Howard. I was thinking of like universities, just to talk more about universities and their increasing modes of bringing, you know, ChatGPT, AI speakers and things like that to campuses, the siphoning off of students and intellectual prowess, you know, that could otherwise be engaged in political homes and organizations, where you talked about that at the beginning, and then thinking about how the increasing, like PACA, Pan-African Community Action, just had an event earlier talking about the DC crime bill, and we have a president at the national level doubling down on borders and preventing migrants and violent approaches locally. So think about crime, surveillance, technology, and just thinking about how, you know, it's a site to respond to in an organization, but also the people that we are losing just because they need a job or want a job and trying to keep a means of living.
Yeah, I mean, so there's so much one could say. one thing, again, this is why it's important to think about the prison as a microcosm, because, you know, in the 1970s, a lot of these imprisoned intellectuals were talking about how fascism is already here and it's only going to intensify, and that more people are going to realize it as time passes. And that was 50 years ago, right? And they were looking at the world through the specific lens of the prison, saying that, you know, essentially what James Baldwin said in his letter to Angela Davis, you know, if they're coming for you this morning, they'll be coming for us the next night, or some version like that. Yeah, thank you for bringing up the crime bill here in DC, which essentially, you know, gives police outsized power, reduces their oversight, intensifies pretrial detention, all of these things that we know. It's not that they don't work, it's just that they don't work for us. They do work if the goal is to criminalize populations, right? And so, yeah, this is something that definitely needs to be opposed. And I think we need to have more of a critical understanding of what crime actually is. It's not an objective thing, right? It's a political relationship that, you know, the people who are responsible for reporting crime and recording it, right, is in fact the police, right? And there's all this data that shows the ways in which crime can be manipulated, right? So that's not to say that there aren't actual real issues with public safety and harm in our communities, which of course we know there are, right? But the category of crime does not capture that relationship, right? And the use of crime as a way to intensify these different carceral technologies is really, I think, an expression of a war on our community, this ongoing war. And so, yeah, these are things that, as you mentioned, need to be opposed via organization and to sharpen our analysis of how these things work, which hopefully the book makes a contribution towards us doing.
Yeah, just quickly. I mean, just quickly to add to the piece on the universities, I think universities are complicit. We have to accept that as the reality. It takes a lot for some people to accept that, so I just say that out front. But universities are complicit. That's what their function is. But at the same time, it means it can be a site of organizing, right? And so all of us live in spaces or working spaces, or inhabit spaces that are complicit, right? And so we can use those spaces that we are in to organize and to engage in not just exposing the contradictions, but working to radically undermine those, radically transform those particular spaces. You know, Tony K. Bombara says, either we dismantle it or transform it. These are the only two options. I'm with both of them. So quite frankly, it's the invasion of these new technologies into these universities only further solidifies their ongoing function. I don't see it as a departure at all. Like, tech bros aren't going to transform Black life. We're gonna make it worse at most, right? And so AI is a challenge because it's an aggregator of data. They don't create new knowledge. It might be new to you, right? But it aggregates what already exists. The status quo is what already exists. And so it further aggregates what already exists. This is a problem. This is not revolutionary. So that's the nutshell answer. But you know, where I work, where Ori works, we know we are not in the bubble of people who think that, oh my God, we work at universities, we're great. No, these places are dangerous and violent, and we have to be clear about that.
We have a question from an online viewer, Nefertiti. They ask, Dr. Burton, I've heard you use the term extreme nonviolence in a recent talk. Can you say more about what that means?
Sure, thanks, Mom. So I used that talk, I think that was 2 days ago. I did a talk at Georgetown. That might have been yesterday. I can't remember. It was this week. I did a talk on Martin Luther King's eulogy for the martyred children, which was the eulogy he gave for the 4 little girls who died, who were killed in the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. And we were actually just talking about this. You know, that bombing, I think, accelerated a shift in the Black liberation struggle, a shift away from what King called his tactical theory of nonviolent direct action, and an embrace of what Muhammad Ahmad, formerly known as Max Stanford, called the insurrectionary stage of the Black liberation struggle, which he marks right at that year, 1963. And so part of what the book tries to do, and part of what I was trying to do with the talk, is to really unpack the question of violence, right? And argue that violence is, when the question is raised, it's always raised to the people who are the primary recipients of violence. And so when I use the phrase extremist nonviolence as a kind of play on the way that extremism is usually used, which is violent extremism. And part of what I tried to do is show that, you know, the tactical theory of nonviolence actually also is the use of violence through its negation, right? And so nonviolence was not the absence of violence. It was, in fact, the presence of violence. It was just one directional violence. And the theory behind that nonviolence was that a third party, or even the aggressive party, would see that the people who are receiving this violence and not responding were suffering, and that they would have a moral awakening that would force them to sort of rethink themselves. And so that theory had a major hold on the movement, and I think that hold started to fray in 1963, and the bombing facilitated that shift. And of course, we know that Kwame Ture said that, you know, part of King's mistake there was that he believed that America has a conscience, and it doesn't. And that's the only way that that theory would work. So yeah, extremist nonviolence is the refusal to reciprocate violence, even if it means, you know, the loss of your own life or the loss of your community's lives.
Please, thank you for being here in this talk. I had a question about the concept that you, I'm just Kim, a member of the community. I'm interested in how you frame the Black underground in particular, and you use members of the Panther 21 trial as an example of how that comes out of you know, the carceral state. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the Black underground in relation to prisons, but also on the outside, and what that kind of looks like today, and is there a use for it in the way that we're organizing on the ground today as well? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, part of what I tried to do with the book is to use it as an opportunity to allow us to revisit some of the insights that had been generated over the past you know, cycle of the Black liberation struggle that in fact was interrupted by the prison. And again, this is the political function of the prison. It was to interrupt the intergenerational transmission of knowledge and to interrupt the development of these movements. And a key part of the knowledge I think we not lost, but I think a key piece of knowledge that has been slower to reach younger generations is the debate that was happening within the movement at this time around this question, right? This question around above ground and underground activity. And essentially, you know, the above ground activity is exactly what it sounds like. It's the kind of organizing that you can do within the confines of the system. And the idea that was percolating, especially around, you know, the emergence of underground formations, was that, you know, irrespective of the methods that Black people use to secure their freedom and liberation, if they're successful, they're going to experience repression. That is just the dynamic that we're in, because what we're in is war. That's what they were saying. And so in order for any movement to be successful, the theory was there's also going to have to be an underground component, a clandestine component, a component whose function is to try to relieve pressure from above ground movements, people who are willing to bear the brunt of retaliation, people who are willing to find non-legal ways of funding the movement. This is the debate that was happening. People who are going to be willing to break people out of prison when they get incarcerated. These were the conversations that were happening. And there were people who were willing to take those risks, who knew the risks and who took them anyway. One of them just passed away last week, rest in peace to Sekou Odinga, who was part of the formation that broke Assata Shakur out of prison in 1979, and was later incarcerated for it. A comrade of mine, Jared Ware, asked him, you know, if it was worth it after he spent 30 years in prison, and he said, yeah. You know, so I think the debates that were happening in the 60s and 70s and even in the 80s said essentially that no liberation struggle has been successful without an underground component. And what an underground looks like now is a question for folks to talk about, to think about, right? And I'm not presenting myself as an expert on that. What I did was, you know, look at the archive, talk to elders, and try to narrate these movements and the contradictions and the insights that they generated, and to present it in a way that can, you know, be useful for people who are organizing now.
We have time for one or two more questions from the audience.
Hi, how are you?
Hello.
I am actually here with my daughter from Bucknell University in Pennsylvania. I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but this was a long drive. So, but with me not knowing what I was getting myself into when I accompanied her, I find this rather intriguing. And for people, I guess, that does not know or that's not aware, that may really be intrigued, are there other means or other ways that you can connect, or do you have audiobooks for people that really don't like reading 200 pages or 150 pages? Is there some other way, even if it's captions on the side? Because I probably would not have been interested in picking up the book. But listening to you, how detailed you are, just makes me want to say, you know, wow, these two ladies right here are writing down everything you're saying. Thumb notes. Like, are there thumb notes beside it? So it really makes me want to involve myself and learn more, because I know of today what's going on with DC jail and the jails and everything surrounding us, even the jail that's in Pennsylvania that closed down. I'm aware of the struggle and the stuff that's happening today. What's the difference between then versus now? The mentality that you find. I know you said you do your research. I know I'm asking a lot, but you know, I'm really curious. So I would like to thank you for presenting it.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you. You know, there's people in this room who are doing really good work to create study guides and small sort of snippets and excerpts. So like, you know, Kyle, I appreciate you and other folks here. So there are folks who are figuring out ways to try to distill and communicate some of the stuff that's in the book in other ways. I've done a lot of talks on YouTube, as has Brother Josh, and you know, there's other resources that we could plug you into. And the book is being made into an audio book. So I'll post that when that happens. The difference between now and then is that, you know, so I'm focusing on 1970 to 1980. You know, in the ensuing decades, you know, there's been a de-radicalization, demobilization on the movements on the outside, by and large, and on the inside. And part of what that has to do with is precisely what we were talking about, that prisons have evolved as counterinsurgent methods. And so I end the book with a story about a brother who's just leaving Attica. And he encounters an argument between young brothers who are fighting over what they're going to watch on TV. And he reflects on the fact that when he went in, there were very few TVs in prisons, and brothers would try to smuggle things in to read, and often they would be reading George Jackson or other things that really spoke to their experience and tried to politicize them. And then I reveal a statement by a prison administrator who said, look, incarcerated people can spend their next, their sentence plotting trouble, or they could watch TV, And so really thinking about the ways in which the introduction of TVs and now tablets and all these other measures are also designed to de-radicalize the population. Also, the amount of prisons and their capacity has increased, their capacity to isolate people and to sort of separate different classes of incarcerated people from each other. So those who are political are often separated from like younger populations who they understand might be more impressionable. So it's been very sophisticated. At the same time, I've gotten letters from people who are inside who have read my book who were like, yep, you got it. Like, this is what we've been talking about. I'm glad somebody finally said it. And this is, I guess, the thing I'll say just lastly is that, much of what you're responding to have to do with an analysis that was developed collectively over a long period of time, right? And so many people who read my book have that experience of saying, oh, this is what we've been saying, right? And so it's not so much that there's a whole lot of new material in the book or new analysis or new language, but it's a way to really distill down some of the knowledge that's been accumulating over time and to hopefully present it in a way that people can digest. But thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for this book. I'm Yvonne. I wanted to ask a question, I think, building on what you're talking about bribery, as a mode of counterinsurgency. I was thinking about Israel's defense in its ICJ case, right, is that they couldn't possibly be committing genocide because they're also engaging in it, and so I guess I'm asking about what kinds of things have been effective in continuing to move the movement forward inside of the prisons, given the reality of all of these different mechanisms of bribery and counterinsurgency. How are people able to turn people's attention away from the TVs toward the reading, given how easy it is to sort of fall into depoliticization and being demobilized? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I personally know people who are doing that work, and who, a lot of them are very dejected, I'm not gonna lie. It's like, it's hard work for them to try to continue to do the politicization work. For instance, in New York, every year on September 13th for decades, there would be a silent fast in remembrance of Attica. That was just a practice that was that had been ongoing, and my understanding is that it's almost all but done as a practice, except for a few people who do it individually. I think, people are planting seeds everywhere, and they're seeds that we might not necessarily see or know, right? Like when the rebellions happened, those came out of nowhere, for some, right? But so people are planting seeds. And this is why intimacy, the question earlier about intimacy and care, is so important, because there are these spaces where people come together and they have conversations, they're passing on knowledge, like that's constantly happening. And if you talk to people who have been inside, this idea of war is not hard for them to accept. They understand it, and they have access to elders who have, that intergenerational continuity of knowledge. So it's happening, but it's also difficult because so much of the counter to this consciousness raising, the countervailing forces are quite powerful in the way that apolitical, depoliticized gang activity is encouraged, the way that drugs are being transmitted behind the walls, the TVs and the tablets. So it's a steep climb, but it's also there's people all over the country and the world doing amazing work. A lot of it I'm not even privy to, and so it's kind of like it's a question I can't answer, because it's like, and this is part of what I try to emphasize to people. It's like I'm someone who's chronicling things historically, right? But people who are engaged in the movement are the ones who are really on the cutting edge of theory, and so I'm almost not even the one to answer the question, right? But I do know it's happening, because that's, the way I've trained myself to see and to think. But in terms of the actual practices and what people are doing, I would encourage you to get involved if you're not already in, like letter writing opportunities and building connections with folks behind the walls, because there's a lot of work happening.
Iana Phillips asks, can you please share Black radical thought readings for beginners?
Y'all know I struggle with that one, because I think we should be reading everything. Go on Sankofa.com and blindly Black radical thought for beginners. I think in teaching at Howard, one of the things that has been transformative for 18, 19-year-olds is Robin D.G. Kelly's Freedom Dreams as a beginning. So this is a book that both offers a historical genealogy, but there's some urgency behind the way that he connects this to what we were talking about earlier, which is like a rebellious spirit. So it's not dry. It invites people to see themselves and to see the things that they have been thinking about and grappling with in connection to a community of struggle. And I've seen that work effectively at the level of 18, 19. So I guess they would be beginners maybe. We're sitting in here in Sankofa, and I can remember when I was a beginner, I guess, in 2008. I don't know how many years ago that was. But right upstairs, every Wednesday afternoon for a whole summer, there was a group that came together to read Solo Dad Brother by George Jackson. I don't know how I ended up in this group, but once I was in, I was in. And study groups, and this goes to the earlier question about how to make this more, I don't want to use the word accessible, but how to bring more people into this practice that wouldn't necessarily pick up a 200-page text. Isn't reading together, to me. That's what marks this. Reading should not be isolated, and study should not be isolated. And when you are doing this with other people, it becomes much more conceivable for you. And that's what happened to me as a beginner. We were reading groups, and once we did Solo Dad Brother, we did Harold Cruz, The Christ of the Intellectual, and then we did Ready for Revolution. And then once that study group ended, I found another one, and we just kept reading and reading and reading and reading. And I mentioned these memoirs and autobiographies because that's how I learned the history first. I didn't learn from historians. I learned from the people that actually did it. And then I went to the historians for the, fill in lines and also to get their politics, but that's not the question. But it was in engaging with the genre of memoir and autobiography as a beginner that allowed me to connect to it. I'll never forget the first time, it's right after I read Solo Dad Brother, the first time I read the chapter in Ready for Revolution, Howard University, every Black thing and its opposite. I was like, this man just narrated my life. But also in that narration is he's talking about the movement. And so now it's like, why did he go from Howard into the movement? What went into that decision? And so it's not just learning about theory and historiography, it's also learning about what radical commitment looks like from someone that actually lived it. That's what I would say to beginners.
I think we can take one last burning question during. Okay. Do you want to leave us, either of you or both of you want to leave us
I
with
think
the
I
word?
just said it. Read. But yeah,
No, just to express my gratitude that you all took the time out to come here, and I hope you leave with something that helps you move forward in a way that is productive for all of us. So thank you.
Thank you.
follow what this brother is doing too. Like he's on social media.
The book can be purchased in the back counter with Sister Christina and Brother Dion. Can y'all wave your hands? Yep. The book is back there. If you'd like to purchase it, come back up here to have it signed. Otherwise, thank you so much.
It's another event today, right?
There is. Thank you. What is it? There's another event happening at 6 o'clock. What's it called? Empowered Woman, starting at 6 o'clock this evening. So if you want to, you can stick around. That's only a couple hours away. But thank you again for being here. Get home safe.
Sure.
Let me grab the marker.